Alright, now a big day in your photographic career. Reach your fingers up and take it from automatic knucklehead setting and put it on the master setting, manual function setting. Switch that thing to the M. In order to understand the manual functions of your camera, you first got to understand the exposure triangle, which consists of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, also known as f-stop. A camera is much like the human eye and the brain, with the aperture being the pupil of the eye. The pupil is a hole in your eye that gets bigger and smaller when it's darker or lighter. The lighter it is outside, the smaller the hole. The darker it is outside, the larger the hole to let in more light. The aperture is measured in f-stops. And whoever came up with the measuring system for this needs to be kicked in the shin because it's backwards. The smaller the F number, the more light it lets in. The larger the number, the less light it lets in. The f-stop is a vital piece to creating a perfectly exposed picture that's not too dark and not too bright, but it also has an effect on your picture. A smaller numbered f-stop will give you shallow depth of field, which will give you a narrow plane of focus with the image being blurred in front and behind that narrow plane. A larger numbered f-stop will give you large depth of field, which means it will be in focus from near to far. An easy way to remember an f-stop, its properties and effects, is to use the words little, big, little, where the first little stands for the f-stop number, the big stands for amount of light, and little stands for little depth of field or shallow depth of field. The opposite would be big, little, big, where you would have a big numbered f-stop, a little amount of light that it lets in, and a large or big depth of field. Zooming also has an effect, where if you want to create very shallow looking depth of field, go ahead and put your camera on a small numbered f-stop and then zoom in as well, and you'll get ultra shallow looking depth of field. So let's do a little review here. What I have listed here are the f-stops of the lens that I have. Your lens may not start at 2.8. It may be a number a little bit higher than that, but after that, the f-stops will be the same on your camera. Now, what we have here is on the left, 2.8, 3.5, and 4. Those are our littlest numbers, but they're going to let in the most amount of light, and they will create shallow depth of field. Little, big, little. At the end of the f-stop spectrum of your lens, you're going to have 18, 20, and 22. Those would be the largest numbers. They're going to let in the least amount of light, and they're going to create the largest depth of field of any setting on your camera. When you want shallow depth of field, it helps to zoom if you can, because that will create the illusion of even shallower depth of field, creating what is known as a bokeh effect, a very blurry background. You don't want to zoom at large depth of field, so make sure to back that zoom lens off when you're trying to get large depth of field. Now we're going to move on to the second part of the exposure triangle, the shutter speed. The shutter of the camera can be compared to the eyelid of the human eye. It goes up and down. The longer it's open, the more light it lets in. The shorter it's open, the less light it lets in. The shutter, the amount of time that the shutter is opened is measured in seconds or fractions of a second. Just like the f-stop, the shutter speed is in charge of letting in more or less light, but it also has an effect on your image. The faster the shutter speed, the more it's going to freeze something that's moving. The slower the shutter speed, the more blurred that moving object is going to look. So you've probably guessed that F-stop deals with distance. Now shutter speed deals with motion. The most important shutter speed to remember is 1/60th of a second. I call it the red flag shutter speed. I call it this because it's the slowest shutter speed that you can possibly handhold. Anything slower than 1/60th, like 1/30th or 1/15th, is going to be so slow that it will record the shake in your hands. Your hands can't possibly stay still enough, and you'll get what's called a soft image, where the edges of your subject matter are slightly blurry. So at this point, when you get to 1/30th, you would have to use a tripod. I even use a tripod at 1/60th if I can help it. If you are going to handhold 1/60th of a second, you need to be sniper still and hold your camera as steadily as possible. Take a deep breath and focus very intently on not shaking the camera when you push the shutter release button. So in review, shutter speeds slower than 1/60 are going to blur motion and let in more light. Shutter speeds faster than 1/60th will incrementally freeze motion better and let in less light. It is important while trying to get a blurred motion photo to use a tripod and to make sure that the things that are not moving are sharp while the things that are moving are blurred. A photo that has the motion blurred and the background blurred is just a blurry photo and is junk and should be thrown away. The last corner of our exposure triangle is the ISO. The ISO is like the brain of the camera. It's your camera's sensitivity to light. The higher the number ISO, the more sensitive your camera is to light, so the brighter your picture is going to be. There's a trade-off though. The higher you go on the ISO number, the more noise you're going to see. Cameras these days are getting better at higher ISOs, and the amount of money you spend on a camera a lot of times has to do with your camera's ability to shoot at high ISOs without seeing the noise. You should only start taking your ISO higher when you absolutely have to. In emergency purposes only, I always say. Always try to keep your ISO as low as possible. We'll talk more about emergency situations when you have to start taking your ISO higher in the next video.